everyone. Thanks for coming, and I'm glad we were all be able to figure out our clocks this morning. We had a little moment last night where we suddenly realized things were changing. Anyway, so it's wonderful to be here at Olana, and I certainly thank you for your incredibly generous introduction. I actually started coming here when I was working on my dissertation, so that was back in the Dark Ages. And it's wonderful that so many changes have occurred, and I think the collection and the house is really so much more is going on here, so welcoming to people. So it's really exciting. So today our topic is this work hanging over the fireplace, and I hope you come up. We'll have a chance to come up afterwards and look more closely and chat about it. So I thought I would just speak informally, and then maybe if you have questions, you can keep them towards the end, and we can have a discussion about the issues that most interest you. But so first, just to introduce it, this is a painting called Cayambe. Cayambe, which is a mountain in Ecuador. And I'll just, from now on, I'm just going to mention that whenever I mention a country, it's the present-day name of the country, because in the 19th century, Colombia and Ecuador were New Granada, and then it changes, it has like 3 different names over the course of the time that church was involved. So just easier to say, use the present-day names. So this is a dormant volcano in Ecuador. And as most of you probably do know, church took 2 trips to South America. So this was done on the first trip to South America in 1853. So I thought what I would do is just sort of start to unpack a lot of different issues that this particular work raises, and then sort of bring those to bear on interpreting it. So one of the first things is sort of where did he go, and how did he get there, and why did he go? So church is often linked with the name Alexander von Humboldt, who was a 19th century, he was actually Prussian, but that being in the days before Germany was united. So he was a Prussian explorer, and he, from 1799 to 1804, traveled in South America. Now this was a major coup at the time, because if you think about it, 1799, these countries were still colonial, under colonial rule. It was the rule of Spain. So Spain was jealously guarded these countries, and it was very difficult for anybody, almost impossible really, for anybody to get permission to visit these places. But Humboldt was very persistent. He had a lot of good contacts, I guess, and he eventually did get the permission to travel in these areas. So he actually, so he travels, he goes to, I was told, usually I'm used to speaking with slides, so I'm going to, but you picture the map of South America. So Humboldt travels, he gets to Venezuela, he travels all across Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador. So church follows a good part of Humboldt's route. So how did church know about Humboldt? Well, once Humboldt returned to Paris, he was living in Paris at the time, because that was really the center of intellectual culture, and there were many artists there he was able to employ. So from his return in 1804 until his death in 1859, he churned out book after book after book. So some of them were very specific, descriptive of his travels, and some of them were much more synthetic. So an early book that he did was called the Picturesque Atlas, and I think that one was the one that was most important for this book. So so just imagine if you're heading to South America when church went in 1853. Where the heck do you go? How do you plan your itinerary? Well, one of the things that church did, we know he had Humboldt's books in his library, and so he starts to single out. It's almost as though Humboldt is sort of establishing a natural history itinerary of places to go and things to see in these different countries. And we know that church visited a number of them, and actually Humboldt illustrated Cayambe in one of his books. So we know that there was this direct link. And if you are able to use the library here or ever do research here, there are copies of some of Humboldt's books in the libraries, and some of them are actually annotated. Church was a little bit of a no-no. He wrote in his books. So we know that he had these books. So anyway, so he decides to go to South America, and who does he travel with? He travels on this first trip. He's traveled with his friend Cyrus Field, and I don't know if that name is familiar to anybody. Cyrus Field. He was the one who laid the transatlantic cable. between Europe and North America. So supposedly he had a brother who was lost in South America. No one's been totally able to confirm that this was the case, but that was at least their excuse for heading off to South America together. And I'm sure Field was looking out for various financial opportunities while Church was paying attention to the landscape. So again, imagine how did you get to South America in 1853? It was no easy thing. It required quite a bit of planning. Church would have carried with him letters of introduction because wherever possible, he stopped at different haciendas of the more well-to-do people, and he would show them a letter, and he would stay with some of these families. It wasn't as though they were just a chain of hotels or anything, obviously, at the time. Sometimes he would be camping out. So it was a big bit of a production. But anyway, so he's heading to Colombia. So if you imagine Colombia on the map, it's in the northwest corner of South America, and it's the one country that has the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast. So Church and Field take a steamer to Colombia. They land at this place called Barranquilla, and then they travel down the Magdalena River. So this is one of the early experiences that Church has, is traveling down this river and observing things from the river and traveling along. So the rule of thumb at the time for travel was stay in a boat as long as you can. You don't want to get out of the boat if you don't have to, and travel by burro and overland by foot. So as much as possible, first he's traveling in a larger steamer down the river, then a smaller one. And each day they're stopping, and he's doing sketches and writing in his diary. So again, how do we know what Church was doing? There's a very rich body of material available to study a lot of what he was doing. So first of all, he was a dutiful son, right? His parents are in Hartford, Connecticut, and he writes home to his parents and to his sister Charlotte. So we have letters that he wrote back to the family, describing what he's seeing, and very, a couple of page letters at a time, very interesting letters. He's also keeping a pocket diary, and for a while he tried to teach himself Spanish, or he was learning Spanish. And you can see like his sentences, we call it like gringo Spanish, right? Doesn't see here. That he was not really mastering the language with any great speed, but he would keep a dictionary too, a dictionary at the back of his diary. I always thought this was so touching that he would write all the different foods that he was eating too. So just like all of us, right? We go someplace new, we want to experience the foods. What are these weird things I'm eating? There are all kinds of fruits. So anyway, he's traveling along and doing all these things. So he's on the river. He's traveling through Colombia. He stops in Bogota, which was the present-day capital of the country, but it was in the 19th century a very important Spanish colonial city. That's where Bolivar lived for a while and others. So while he's in Bogota, he takes the side excursion to a big waterfall there called the Tequendama Falls. And this was a famous place, like poets wrote about it, scientists wrote about it. Today it's unfortunately all kind of dried up, but in the 19th century it was like a spectacular big waterfall, and not quite Victoria Falls, but very large. Anyway, he goes there, he wants to make a painting of it. So he talks about the fact that he just can't get a good spot to get out there and really see the waterfall. So he hires, everywhere he went, he would hire local people to help him carry his things and show him the way and be an interpreter. So here he says he got a group of peons, as he called them, the local native people, the peons, to chop down the vegetation so he could get out and get a good view of the waterfall, which he then made numerous studies of. And later, when he came home, he did a large-scale painting of the Tequendama Falls. And this always amuses me. When he would do these paintings and exhibit them, in the National Academy or other places that were available, and the critics said, "Mr. Church should not paint falling water because he cannot." And within 3 years, he definitely proved them wrong, because of course he painted Niagara Falls, which was one of his most famous paintings, and people said that no, even in spite of the fact that Niagara Falls had been painted by hundreds of people, no one painted it as well as Church. They thought this was the ultimate picture. So Church kind of got his revenge, I think, on the critics. But anyway, so then he picks up his knapsack and all those things, and he and Field head on into Ecuador. So he's the Colombian terrain is a little bit different, and he's coming through this pass that, again, Humboldt had described, called the Quindío Pass. He's coming through there, and all of a sudden he has one of these aha moments, and he sort of stops and he said, "This is the most magnificent scenery I have ever seen." And he said, "My ideal of the Cordilleras is realized." So he has this moment where all his study, his reading of the books, everything, he suddenly sees what he thinks he will actually encounter. And this was just this wonderful moment. So from then on, he's kind of hooked on the Andes as a subject. And so this area that he's going from the Quindío Pass down to Quito is often called the Valley of the Volcanoes, because it's just one after another. Not all of them are active, when church was there, but they were dormant. But it was a famous area where, all these volcanoes existed. So, again, why did church care about the volcanoes? And this comes to the question, too, that Will was raising about Heed versus church and why they were interested in different things. I think church was, very much interested, partly from his readings of Humboldt, very much interested in geology. And, he wasn't the only one. His teacher, Thomas Cole, of course, a little bit earlier, had been fascinated by rocks. He has a whole rock collection, which is still, I think, in one of the local historical collections. He's collecting specimens. But he also goes to Italy. Cole goes to Italy, and he does a painting of Mount Etna. And he actually talks about the fact that he went down a little bit into the crater. And, so there's this whole thing about mystique about the volcanoes, because at the time, this is 1840s, 1850s, people weren't really sure. How was the earth formed? How did these things come about? And people thought that the volcanoes held this secret, that it was really literally how mountains formed, these eruptions that came up and spewing rocks and shaping the earth. So these mountains were considered very important to study, because they wanted to know, how did the earth form? What is the history of man? They were starting to realize that the biblical account of 7 days wasn't really quite accurate, but they weren't sure what was replacing it. So exactly how these things happened. So Humboldt was one of the figures. He was called a volcanologist. He was really thinking about this idea that the earth, part of the way that the earth was formed was through these volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. And of course, South America is one of the places that it's like a living laboratory of these forces the church is traveling through. Okay, so finally we get to our subject. Church gets to Cayambe, the mountain Cayambe. And we know that I've been there a couple of times, and once I did actually see the whole mountain with the snow-capped peak and the top. But I can tell you that it's not easy when travelers go to these places. And Church's diary is full of these problems. It was raining. It was cloudy. I mean, Humboldt had the same problem. They couldn't always find a good day to get the view that they wanted. So this view, as you can see here, has clouds up above. So Church writes about the fact that, he got to Cayambe. He was really excited. He wanted to get a really good view, but he said it's covered in clouds. So as he said, I made a very feeble sketch, a few feeble sketches, and then I went home, that night, and I painted and I elaborated the work from recollection. So there are a couple of key points here. First, a feeble sketch. Now, if you ever looked at any of Church's sketches, you know that he was being very modest, that his sketches were never feeble. But there are some works in the Cooper Hewitt where they have a lot of his drawings and oil sketches that where he sketched pretty much this configuration of the top of the mountain, where it had clouds across it and not very much down below. Mainly he was studying the peak. So and this work, I should mention, is done on paper, oil on paper, and then it was mounted on canvas. So sometimes he would have these little panels that he would paint the oil pictures on, but this was oil on paper. So my husband here is James McElhenney. He's a landscape artist, and he works in the field quite a bit, and we were talking about the fact that we think that maybe he did the top part of the work, the peak, maybe on the spot, sitting there, doing it in color, and then later would have elaborate this bottom part, because honestly, there's not really a waterfall right there. There's not, some of the other details, the little figure with the hat, when you come up more closely, you can see it, may not have been right there. But this was Church's practice. He created what he called composite views, and he explains this in the pamphlets that he writes about his friends write for him about his pictures. That he said, it wasn't cheating in the 19th century, but it's this idea that you would take the best of the things that you saw in the general area and combine it into one single view to offer the viewer the most typical and composite scene. So this waterfall might have been a little bit further down the road or something, but he combines them in a way that makes it a characteristic landscape of that area. So this is just one example of the kind of work that he would have done. We know too that Olana actually only has a few of his oil sketches from this trip, right? And there are some at the Cooper Hewitt. But we know that he actually did more than we have. And he talks about the fact that one of his diary entries, he says, one of the burros went over the side, and he had his packs on the burro that had some of his sketches in them. So we know that he lost some sketches on the trip. And also, I mean, sometimes, you make a sketch and it might not be fully dry and something might happen to it. So, it's a miracle that as many works have survived that actually did. So Church is then gathering all this data. He was away for 22 months, so that's about almost a little bit over 5 months. Part of that time was by, he was in the ship coming from New York and the ship going back to New York, but a lot of times he was on the ground. So he's making drawings, he's making sketches, he's writing documentation, all kind of storing this up so that when he comes back, he'll do a large-scale painting. Another thing I might mention about Church that his friend and student William James Stillman talked about this. Stillman studied art with Church, studied painting with Church, but he also went on to be a photographer. He was one of the co-founders of the journal that the artist wrote in called The Crayon in the pre-Civil War era. Anyway, Stillman said, Church had the most remarkable visual memory of anyone I'd ever seen. So, Church could look at a scene like this, and he says, I did it from recollection. Some artists may be, what did I see there? I can't quite remember. But Church would be, Stillman said he could look at a motif and then maybe even the next day or later he could draw it very, very accurately. So all those things came into this process of, how do you travel for 5 months looking at all this material, not making large-scale paintings while he's traveling, just small ones, and then later coming home and synthesizing all this. It takes a kind of certain mind to be able to, I think, synthesize all that. So anyway, so he got him to Cayambe. Now he's traveling further down, and he goes to Quito, which was the capital, was another one of the capitals of the colonial world, the viceroyalty. And he spent some time there. And again, Humboldt had spent time there too. And if you're an artist, again, you might think to yourself, okay, I'd like to meet some local artists. Is anybody painting here or anything going on? Is there a scene? So Humboldt had actually, there was a portrait by Humboldt that some local artists had done. And so Church looks up some of these artists, and it turns out there's a family called the Salas family, S-A-L-A-S. And it's like they're kind of like the Peel family of Ecuador, if you think. Antonio Salas was the patriarch, and so he started out in colonial times. He was a specialist in painting religious paintings. So he would paint saints and Christ and whatever. And so he's doing these religious paintings. Then remember, it was only in the 1820s that these countries get their independence. So there's a big kind of wars of independence. Bolivar's fighting for a united South America. All this is happening in the 1820s. After that, the country switches and becomes more secular, right? So religious paintings aren't as much in demand. There's more demand for portraiture and other things. So the Salas family then kind of migrate over to that. So Church meets these people. And here's this, just imagine if you're the Salas sitting there, in your colonial town, you don't meet many travelers. Here comes this man from New York and with his friend, and he's fascinated by the mountains. He's fascinated by the landscape. And so I think this helped to generate much more interest in landscape painting in Ecuador. Church and other travelers that I'll mention in a minute coming through this area, as well as, of course, Humboldt. They had been aware of Humboldt. So people started to take much more interest in the landscape. And we know that there was one little sketch that Church did of Cotopaxi, another one of this mountains in Ecuador. And he gives it to the Salas family and leaves it there. So it's just a little picture. But it ended up, if any of you saw the exhibition last year, the Cisneros collection, or it was
2 years.
Sorry, 2 years ago. The Cisneros collection, it was Teresita Fernandez confronts Frederick Church, and they had some of the small oil sketches up. Well, anyways, the Cisneros collection acquired that little painting by Salas that the Salas family owned. They kept it all that time. The Salas family actually formed an art academy in Quito and kept this little picture in the academy. And then, of course, later it was quote-unquote rediscovered. The school must have needed money or something. And they sold the painting, and the Cisneros family acquired it. So I think this is another important link in the story, that the artist travelers coming to these places but didn't necessarily have their own landscape tradition, then they start to become more aware of their own landscape as a result of these travelers, and begin to depict these different places. So then, has anyone been to Ecuador? So you know that then Quito, then you can now you can take, there's a train that you can take down to the coast, but they of course didn't have the train then. But you start to see this again incredible change of scenery, because you're up in the highlands in Quito and you're traveling down to the coast, which is the tropical coast. And so they traveled back down to the coast, seeing all these different kinds of landscape, and then they take a ship. You have to catch a ship in Guayaquil, which is the coastal port, back up to the Isthmus of Panama. So in those days, there was no canal yet, 1853. So you had to cross the canal, the Isthmus of Panama, by land, and then get a ship on the other side of the isthmus and go up to New York. So it was quite a production to do all this travel, and that was the way Church and Field ended up getting back to New York. So then as Church is, okay, what do I do with all these sketches? Do I exhibit a picture this year? And then he decided, I think, to wait a year. It wasn't really quite ready to create a large-scale exhibition picture. And when he eventually does, he does the waterfalls that I mentioned. He also does another picture called The Andes of Ecuador, which is in the Renolda House in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. But he's thinking to himself, I think, as he's doing these pictures, I really need to go back and look again, because we traveled for 5 months, I saw so much, but now I know exactly the kinds of subjects that I want to do the second time. So I need a second look, because now I know. So they again decide to travel in 1857. He decides to go back, but this time a much more concentrated look just in Ecuador. And he goes to Chimborazo, he goes to Cotopaxi, and he goes to Cayambe again. So that brings me back then. So he does, after the second trip, he does more studies of Cayambe, and he does a major painting of this particular mountain. So this sketch would have contributed to his thinking about this picture, which is in the New York Historical Society. I don't know if some of you have seen it, but it's basically the similar configuration of the mountain, but now he shows without the cloud, and in the foreground there's a ruin. There is a pre-Columbian ruin. So, and that again, I think, signals us to another important point about Cayambe, because the country Ecuador is on the equator, hence the name Ecuador. But this particular mountain is exactly on the equator. It's like a natural landmark. And people at the time were very they believed in natural signs and symbols, right? The idea that this would have been located directly on this 0 degrees latitude and marking kind of the center of the world was a very important point. And so I think that, although Church didn't usually add little Columbian ruins or references of that sort to his paintings, in that case he did. I think partly because he thought of this as a kind of timeless place where that kind of ruin could belong. So that's just one of my thoughts about it. But he also, the painting ends up being commissioned by a man named Robert L. Stewart. And the Stewart collection first went to the New York Public Library, and then, being a library, they didn't really want to take care of all the paintings, so they put it on quote-unquote permanent loan to the New York Historical. So Robert L. Stewart was, does anyone know that name?
Department store? What?
He was a sugar manufacturer, yeah. So anyway, and he had a huge library, and he had also an incredible art collection, but he had a whole collection of natural history. So when you see some pictures of Church's painting and other paintings hanging in his gallery, it wasn't just an art gallery. Down below were all these cases of natural history specimens. So again, it was this perfect place for a Church to have his work. But even better, Stewart owned all these books about the pre-Columbian ruins. He owned Kingsborough, this book by Kingsborough, which was this huge folio volume that showed all these pictures of the ruins. And so again, and Kingsmore had this whole theory that the Incas and the Aztecs were really descended from the from the tribes of Israel and all this. So they were all like playing fast and loose with these facts. But again, that idea that was the perfect picture. We don't know exactly what went on when the letter just says church. This painting was commissioned by Stuart. What does that mean? Does it mean Church and Stuart sat down and chatted about all the details? Does it just mean he wanted any old painting by Church? We don't know, but we can imagine that Church tried to accommodate some of Stuart's tastes and different conditions. Another point that I think is really interesting to think about. How are we doing on time? Is just the idea that Church becomes kind of a center point for people in New York interested in Latin America. And we don't think of this today so much, but there actually were quite a few Latin Americans living in New York in the 1850s and 60s. And one of them was a man named Antonio Paez. I don't know if that name is familiar to anyone. He had been the president of Venezuela. And Venezuela then, as now, was pretty unstable. So after being president for a little while, he was ousted. And rather than sticking around and being executed or something, he decided to come to New York. So he came to New York with his son, Ramon Paez. And it turns out, so they all got to know Church because, again, Church had this reputation for having this knowledge about Latin America, but also a sympathy and a fascination with it. And so they got to know him. And Paez is doing a travel book, and he said, Church, will you do some illustrations for me? And so, there was this back and forth. But again, we have a series of 3 letters from Paez asking Church. He wants to buy a painting from Church. And he said, Church, will you do this painting of Cotopaxi for me? And by the way, could you put one of your beautiful palm trees in there? And Church said, Ramon, come on. There are no palm trees growing anywhere near Cotopaxi. I mean, if anyone should know, you should. But I want to accommodate you as much as possible. So I'm going to do the picture looking down from above and looking up at the mountain so I can put the palm trees in at the logical geographic location, but still you would have your palm trees in your mountain and we'll all be happy. So we don't know exactly what happened to that one painting. We don't know exactly which one it was in his collection. But just gives you a little bit of an idea of there was the reality of South America, and which Church knew because he had been there, but then there were also the different demands that are put on a painting and the things you want in a painting to make them pleasing to you as a viewer. So these things, all kind of come into the accommodation of how Church created these pictures. Just one more point that, 2 more points that I want to end on. One is that this fascination with the pre-Columbian ruins was continued on Church's part. And he actually, later in life, when he can't travel to South America anymore because of health and other conditions, he starts traveling to Mexico. And there he acquired various different things that you can see in the house, including, of course, his wonderful sombreros downstairs, right? Somebody should do a collection, something about the sombrero collection. But anyway, he also acquired several stone relief slabs that he said were Aztec, and that it showed an eagle devouring heart. There were 2 of them. And to this day, they hang, and he gave them, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. So then he comes back from his various travels, and he becomes involved. He says, looks around, okay, New York doesn't have a major museum. How can we exist in a kind of environment? We have great artists, we have all these things going on, we have opera, we don't have a major museum. So Church was one of the people who was in on the ground floor of founding the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And another artist, Ken, was involved as well. So later he starts saying, okay, we have European art in the museum, but we don't have American art is not really being honored. So he said he writes to the museum director and he said, I want to give my Aztec slabs to the museum in the hope that one day there'll be a gallery of the Americas. And so again, this kind of wonderful has such a vision for the fact that these things should be being observed in art museums, which at the time they weren't. If they were anywhere, they would have been in an anthropology museum or something. So that piece is still hanging in the Met, so you can see that. And then the final point is just really that the fascination with Latin America that Church always had. He goes twice to South America. It was a great personal expense, and a great amount of time. He later goes to Jamaica, and then he also, in the 80s and 90s, when he can't go to these other places anymore, he continues to go to Mexico. So there was something very specific about these places that had a real fascination. Some of the people you may not know, like Norton Bush, Henry Ferguson, his friend when he went to Jamaica, Horace Walcott Robbins. There's a whole body of people, maybe 40 artists or so, who then all traveled to South America. I think partly, many of them partly as a result of Church's inspiration. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions.
How dangerous was it traveling in South America vis-a-vis like natives or disease or mosquitoes?
That's a good question. How dangerous was it really? I mean, he did face, a fair amount of, not necessarily, I think, physical threats from people because, he planned things fairly carefully, so he would get in touch with officials and he would have letters of introduction, and he was carrying, U.S. documents too. He got documents from the U.S. government. So the church doesn't talk about this, but another traveler, John L. Stevens, who was looking for the ruins in the Mayan ruins, he talks about the fact that, a lot of times he felt badly doing this, but he'd pull out some official letters that had some gold stamps and some ribbons and things, and people would actually, respect that because they didn't want to, mess with that kind of authority, so they thought that he had authority. He also would travel everywhere he went. He usually tended to hire people to travel with him when he was in more remote places to help them carry things, but I think those people also eased the way. But I mean, part of the danger was more like disease, eating foods that you're not used to or that could be bad, or so all those things. At one point, Field was pretty sick. They had to stop and not travel. They couldn't travel for a while because of Field. So I think some of the danger was as much health-wise as anything.
I'm not a painter, so this may be a dumb question. But I'm fascinated with painting on oil paints on paper. And is that oil paint on paper?
Yes. Yes, and then later it was mounted on a canvas. James, maybe you can address this one.
It's fairly common practice. I mean, paper is more portable, takes up less room.
Right. But the strength of it.
There's plenty of paper that's it's not really an issue. It's more the portability. I mean, canvas has all sorts of other problems. It has to be stretched. It can attract humidity in other ways. There are more ways for it's harder to travel with canvas.
I guess paper in the 1850s is different than copy paper in the...
Oh yeah, it's not
I mean, I think actually...
Heavy weed paper.
Paper today, you can still buy high quality, archival, acid-free paper, even hard enough to be a board, like 300-pound arches is essentially a panel. So, those things were always available, as was foolscap and cheap paper and pulp paper, which, of course, is a lot of inherent vice and not worth working on. But I'm sure that what the church was using would have been what we call watercolor paper, and just simply applying a ground to it, perhaps a blue, rabbit skin blue or something like that, to act as a barrier so that the oil doesn't penetrate the paper and come through or otherwise compromise the paper. It's a very common practice. And people like Corot did it,
Does it affect the value if it's painted on paper versus painted on canvas?
I mean, some people may think so, but I mean, I think that...
But some of these things were really made to be for sale. For example, he didn't really
they
ever
were not.
intend to sell this one, so he wasn't worried about that. That was more like a personal document that he's going to use.
Research.
When he comes back to the studio, he spreads out all his sketches, his drawings, his oil sketches, and then he starts composing his final pictures from there. So a lot of artists would never sell or give away some of these studies ever, because it was like their precious research materials. They just wouldn't do it. He also sometimes did paint on the panels, more like a heavy cardboard. But then that had the problem of he'd have these little racks that they'd have to put the panels in, and so that was kind of a pain in the neck to carry around too. So there was no perfect solution to the problem of traveling for months and months. Humboldt, when he traveled, a lot of times he would stop anytime he got near a place that would have any mail carriers or anything, he would pack up some of the specimens that he had collected in his own sketches and send them back to Europe. But it was always there was no perfect solution. You could lose them, you could run into bad weather, or somebody could steal them. Which other artists talk about the fact that they were robbed, and to your point, Church never was, but some were, and they lost things. So it was just a tricky thing. Yeah.
Also, you can say that oil in a tropical area, in a humid area, was probably a better medium to use than watercolor, which was the traditional expeditionary medium that was used by the military and explorers and so forth, and is more portable. But because of humidity and other things, watercolor would maybe there would be concerns about it being less permanent and durable.
I mean, Church generally did less watercolor. It didn't do so much watercolor.
No.
It wasn't a big watercolor.
Like Moran later.
Yeah, Moran was one. Yeah.
And you talked in the beginning of your talk, you alluded to this tension between the religious commitment that Church felt and his interest in, I guess you'd call it geologic ecology or evolutionary geology. Could you just talk a little more about that?
Sure, yeah, Church.
And whether we can locate that at all in the work, that
Okay.
tension.
Yes. So Church was certainly, very, very religious person. He was a Protestant, and he even talks about the fact that as he's traveling, when he travel on Sunday, he considers sketching work and making his drawings work. So he said, I don't work on the Sabbath. So he would travel for 6 days. I mean, they could travel on the Sabbath, but he didn't actually draw because he considered that his business. So his work. So he didn't do that. So there start to be these people who are advocating for a different way of looking at the creation of the world. And certainly after 1859, you have the Darwin's Origin of Species, and this becomes even more of an issue after 59 and after the Civil War. And Church even, sometimes talks about this idea that, the reconciliation of religion and science. And so I think a picture like this, and some of the pictures that he does of the volcanoes that are erupting, are showing this idea that even if we have to extend the biblical timetable, like it's not, okay, we have to agree, it didn't all happen in 7 days, but that still natural forces could have created the earth, and this could have been all put into place by the divine, right, by God, and so even though it might be a volcanic eruption, it might be erosion from a waterfall or something, still all these things can be explained as being done by the hand of God. And even when you see some of the volcanoes, for example, this one isn't, the Cotopaxi was another one that had a perfectly shaped cone, and he paints it exactly that way, like a perfect triangle. And people talk, and he and other people talk about that idea, that was the evidence of the divine in nature shaping, because they said, well, you would never get such a perfect triangle if it just happened because of some natural eruption. The hand of God had to shape this. And so there was always this discussion at the time about this idea that God's hand had to be into it, in it. And I think someone like Heed, I think that's partly Heed is looking at the organic world. He's looking at the birds and the flowers and other things. And I think he's more Darwinian. He's kind of leaning more towards a more modern view of things. And Church, I think, is still sort of clinging to this older kind of idea, the ideology about God as being the divine mover of things. So it was frustrating. I think over time later he writes, I wish science would take 10 years off so I could catch up. Because it's just so hard to, as an artist, but to keep reading all this material.
Are there Latin American cultural influences that get into the way the landscape is presented? The senses that you would have had down there that influence the way the landscape is depicted?
Yeah, that's a good point. This one particular painting doesn't necessarily bring it up so much, but there's some of them where, for example, there are some of the views of the mountain where he shows a very particular, configuration of the peak or something. Cotopaxi is one example. And there were stories back from the time of the Incas where they said that the way these volcanoes were formed is that the gods blew the top off the mountain, and then this thing was stuck on the side, this sort of double peak. And Church makes a very specific point of of showing that exact configuration. So, and then when he's in Quito, I didn't mention this, but when he's in Quito, he writes to some of his friends, and instead of saying Quito, he writes, "I'm in the second city of the Incas," because the whole idea that Cusco, of course, was considered in Peru was considered like the hotbed of Inca culture, but Quito was the second city of the Incas, and he sends back to his friend. He said, "I'm going to get some of the musical instruments that the Indians play here because he calls it Inca music." And so he's clearly, all these pictures I think have multiple layers. There is just the empirical observation, but I like to think of it as art, science, and religion kind of all coming together. And to that you might even add like the mythology of the local people that you can almost peel back the layers and have different interpretations according to whether you're looking at it from the point of view of science, religion, wider culture. Even interaction with the local people, all these things are included. Because when you come up and look at it, you'll see that he does include the one little figure with the red poncho. And of course, red in the midst of a green landscape is a common motif. But this is a figure of a native person with a poncho right near his thatched roof hut. So he did make a point of including the local people, and he talks about the faith of the people, that he was struck by how the devotion, and in some of the pictures he shows a roadside cross of people standing at the cross, and he's respectful compared to some. If you read some of the travel literature of the time, it makes your hair stand on end because it was so politically incorrect. The Protestants hated the Catholics. They really make very wild horrible comments about some of these people. The church is more respectful. He would say, he thought that the faith of the people was very kind of inspiring to him. I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
Well, you've been addressing this. I was struck by your statement. He wasn't cheating. So are these things supposed to be empirically correct, or like a photograph, or what?
No, they're not supposed to be a photograph. I mean, his teacher, Thomas Cole, would always talk about this idea. He said, it's not mere imitation of nature. Just to imitate nature, literally would actually, it was almost like an insult to nature, right? That you were an interpreter. He was an interpreter, and church is an interpreter. So, and Cole even talks about this idea. You have to let the veil of memory drop down over everything that you've seen, so that only the essentials are then in his mind when he paints. So it's meant to be, yes, this is what Canyon View, the peak looks like. Yes, you could have a waterfall like this, but it's all meant to then combined in this composite type of, which everyone in the 19th century understood. They understood that this would have been a composite and that not necessarily, such a snapshot as we think of it. And don't forget that in 1853, photography could barely have done anything like this anyway. They weren't thinking about photography. Photography came about in a very bare form in 1839, and certainly couldn't be used, traveling like this. It would have been very, very difficult. And, you would never get a shot like this.
But you seem somewhat apologetic in describing that.
Yeah.
I was just wondering.
Oh no, yeah, I didn't mean to sound. It's just that people often think that it's just a one-to-one. Audiences now think that this was a one-to-one thing, and even sometimes in the 19th century, the reviews would talk about this idea of verisimilitude. Like, is this really what things look like? I mean, that was kind of partly what they wanted to know, right? Most people would never go to these places themselves, so church was showing them something about what it looked like. But then when he did Heart of the Andes, for example, if you go to the Met and see Heart of the Andes, he would have these single picture exhibitions. He'd be like here, all of you gathered. Just the Heart of the Andes would be here. There would be pamphlets being sold that would explain the picture. There would be dramatic lighting. There could be palm trees, and so these things were all being explained to the public. And even they talk about in the newspapers, school children were brought to see Church's paintings because they called it a geography lesson in paint. So so these things operated on multiple levels, and so literal truth and artistic truth, I guess.
One way that I often think is an analogy between prose and poetry. Right? If you think about Wordsworth's, daffodils that wandered lonely as a cloud, it's really he's talking about a walk through meadows and fields. And you could see it. Whereas, he comes back and uses his intellect to create a piece of art through, poetry.
Yeah, there are artistic conventions that that people expected. Most people were going to put a picture on a wall, they didn't necessarily just want the bare sketch that Church did when he first. That aesthetic is more later. That idea of seeing the immediacy, that was something that came later. At the time, they wanted a balance, as they said, between the real and the ideal.
Apropos of our earlier conversation, if you look at this picture, the top half, the peak and the cloud, the palette is very different than the bottom half. And actually, the hand, the speed, if you will, the intimacy of touch is very different. The bottom, it's much slower. To use a painterly, I'd say the top is like fast, the bottom is slow.
Meaning more detailed?
Meaning more time spent considering. I think the top half he's capturing, he's describing his response to what he's beholding. And the bottom is more invention. You can see even a shift in the palette. The bottom half has this yellow undertone that's totally absent at the top. So I think no questions.
Is there like a cliff in the bottom half? It's kind of hard to tell from here.
Yeah, there's a cliff here. There's like another rocky formation, and then the waterfall, and then so he's kind of creating this whole. And there are just some sketches that if you can just imagine just the top half of the sketch, there are sketches where he just leaves only the top half with clouds or whatever. That's all he leaves on the page. So sometimes he would just be capturing that, and then other times he would be finishing it.
And this was not a study for a larger picture.
Not directly, but I mean, so what he would do is when he came back, he would say, okay, now I'm going to do Mr. Stewart wants this painting of Cayambe. So he would have taken all his pencil sketches, all his studies of Cayambe, spread them out and thought about, okay, what's the point of view I want for this painting? What should the foreground be? How am I going to put all these different parts together? So this sketch certainly informed that painting, but it's not a one-to-one relationship.
Well, the peak in the top left of part of the Andes is Cayambe.
That's perhaps, yes.
It appears to be.
On that
Please, everyone, do take the time to come up close and